So Dave, you've been watching the events that have been taking place in Libya over the past few weeks, haven't you?
Of course. It's been hard to get away from it after all.
Gaddafi targeting his own citizens like that, it's truly appalling.
Agreed.
So, do you think that setting up a no-fly zone over Libyan airspace would be a good idea?
No, of course not. That is, in fact, a terrible idea.
Terrible. But it would seem to be the ideal way for the free world to help the rebels without incurring too much risk.
I've heard this argument from a myriad of commentators and analysts over the past week. The vast majority of them seem to have little idea of what a no-fly zone entails.
What do you mean?
Well, the first thing is, who's doing it? Is it the United States? The European Union? The Arab League or the African Union? Is it going to be UN or EU sanctioned? What role will the rebels play? In the event of the operation being undertaken by more than one air force, what is the chain of command going to be? How is command and control going to be organized? Whose ships are being used? What air bases? How much of a commitment will be made and how long will it be sustained for? Who, when a pilot is faced with a Libyan opponent, will give the order to fire?
But surely it can't be that complicated.
Oh, it can be done, but then you get into the actual problems. What will the rules of engagement be for the planes being used? Will they engage any aircraft taking off from Libyan soil? What requirements will there be for self-defense? Will suspicious civilian aircraft be targeted? What about any planes that fall into the hands of rebel forces?
Well, I'm sure that can all be sorted out.
Of course. It's not like multinational missions of this nature have ever turned into a complete mess before. But we also have to talk about the amount of ordnance that will have to be dropped on Libya.
What? I'm talking about a no-fly zone, not a bombing run.
But you cannot have one without the other. Any no-fly zone over Libya will require, at the very least, the destruction of land-based anti-aircraft positions and SAM sites in order to protect friendly planes from being shot down.
But Libya's air capability is very antiquated by modern standards, isn't it?
Certainly. And it's not like U.S. aircraft was ever shot down by forces armed with relatively primitive weaponry, is it? And therein you have the nightmare Mogadishu scenario, where a U.S. aircraft is shot down, and the United States is forced to commit troops to save the crew. It happened before, and you better believe that it could happen again. For all its faults, the Libyan Air Force is technologically better than the Somali militias that killed 19 American soldiers in '93. Perhaps a more pertinent example is that of Serbia in the '90s, who did shoot down a U.S. jet during the NATO operation in its airspace. Relatedly, the no-fly zone there utterly failed to prevent events like the Srebrenica massacre. They aren't foolproof ops by any stretch of the imagination. And it's not like America doesn't have any experience sending troops into Arab countries recently. They know how bad that can get. Setting up a no-fly zone in this situation as Libya is currently, is asking for such a scenario to occur.
But a no-fly zone was effective in containing Iraq during the '90s, wasn't it?
To an extent, though Iraq in the 1990s was relatively stable compared to Libya today. Saddam had a good reason not to fire on American planes that were bombing his nation just as they would be forced to do in Libya. He didn't want to antagonize the U.S. into an invasion. Gaddafi, on the other hand, has little to lose at this point. Opinions of the success of the Iraqi no-fly zone are mixed. It is unclear if it really did more harm than good. It certainly didn't cause the Iraqi people to overthrow Saddam. The Iraqi no-fly zone cost $1.5 billion to maintain per year, by the way. You better hope the trouble in Libya doesn't last longer than you think it will, otherwise the cost of a no-fly would be enormous. And then there is the reaction on the ground.
What do you mean? Surely the rebels would appreciate support of this nature.
What, you mean the United States would be welcomed as liberators?
Well, not exactly.
The idea that the United States, seen as the great Satan by so many Arabs, could bomb Libyan soil and suffer no effects is a serious misjudgment, one that would have far-reaching consequences. I notice that some of the more well-known voices clamoring for Obama to implement something of this nature are the same people who thought the Iraqi occupation would be over by Christmas 2003. Gaddafi has already preached a message that the U.S. is leading a conspiracy against him. How convenient it would be for his propaganda if U.S. bombs started raining from the sky. And terrorist and insurgent networks across the world could use such an action to further demonize the U.S. and the West as enemies of Islam, and as interfering colonists. And of course, no one who is advocating the creation of a no-fly zone seems to have thought about what is to be done if Gaddafi stays in power anyway, like Saddam did.
But
I know what you're going to say. The actions of the Gaddafi regime, not just now but throughout its tenure, have been despicable, illegal and horrifying. The chickens are coming home to roost in Libya for decades of oppression and atrocity. I truly hope that something resembling a stable democracy can be created in Libya without further bloodshed, though I am incredibly wary of this velvet revolution. Part of me still thinks these nations are simply picking new dictators to rule them. Many simply feel that the West has to do something, even if it is, in their eyes, something as minimal as a no-fly zone. Remember though, that we, by which I mean the EU and the United States, have to remain committed to our own interests. We have to ask ourselves, to be brutally honest, what is in it for us? What do we get out of a no-fly zone? We could help to overthrow a dangerous dictator. In the short term. But the medium and long-term consequences bear thinking about, as does the cost in human life and finances. Real world. These things are considerations.
so what do you actually think we should do?
We? You mean Ireland and the EU? Nothing, other than ensure that our own citizens get out of the country safely.
And what about the rest of the free world?
Nothing, other than ensure that they get their own citizens out safely.
That's all.
Well, in terms of the EU, it's actually Malta, a member state, that we should be looking to defend and help from potential trouble, both from an increasingly desperate Gaddafi regime and a growing refugee crisis. At most, Western militaries should have some resources placed nearby as a show of force, nothing more. If the rebels get organized enough to have a centralized command structure, and that command structure openly requests assistance, then we can talk about military intervention. Until then, the free world needs to allow Libya the chance to sort itself out, just as Tunisia and Egypt have done. If America should have learned anything from a decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's that you can't just give people freedom at the point of a gun.
So, no no-fly zone.
No no-fly zone.